The rise and fall of Crocodile Dundee, Paul Hogan's greatest creation. He was the man who made the world believe that Australia was a place where legends still walk the earth. With nothing more than a crocodile tooth necklace, a leather vest, and that famous grin, Paul Hogan created a character so powerful, so magnetic, that it would define not just his career but an entire nation's identity for decades to come. But behind the laughter and the box office gold lay a story of obsession, betrayal, and the crushing weight of expectations that would ultimately destroy the very thing that made Paul Hogan immortal. This is the untold story of Mick Dundee, not the sanitized Hollywood version, but the raw, unvarnished truth about how a simple idea became a global phenomenon, and how that phenomenon became both a blessing and a curse that would haunt Paul Hogan for the rest of his life. From the creative lightning in a bottle that sparked the original masterpiece, to the desperate attempts to recapture that magic, to the bitter realization that some dreams are too big to survive their own success. Chapter 1: The Birth of a Legend. The genesis of Crocodile Dundee began not in a Hollywood boardroom, but in the fertile imagination of a man who understood that the world was hungry for something authentic in an age of increasing artifice. Paul Hogan had spent years perfecting his everyman persona on Australian television, but by the early 1980s, he and his creative partner John Cornell knew they had outgrown the small screen. They needed a bigger canvas, a grander stage on which to paint their vision of what Australia could mean to the world. Paul had been thinking about the character of Mick Dundee for a while, recalled those close to the development process. The character wasn't born fully formed. He evolved organically from Paul's television work, his advertising campaigns, and his instinctive understanding of what made Australians unique in the global imagination. Mick Dundee was the distillation of every romantic notion the world held about Australia, the land of the rugged individualist, the place where men were still men and nature still held dominion over civilization. But creating the character was only the beginning. The real challenge lay in crafting a story that would showcase Mick Dundee's unique worldview while entertaining audiences who had never set foot in the Australian outback. Cornell and Hogan spent months developing the concept, understanding that they were walking a tightrope between authenticity and accessibility, between honoring Australian culture and making it comprehensible to international audiences. The breakthrough came with a deceptively simple premise. Take this authentic Australian character and drop him into the most artificial environment imaginable, New York City. The culture clash would generate comedy, but more importantly, it would allow audiences to see both worlds through fresh eyes. Mick Dundee would be simultaneously the sophisticated and the innocent, understanding fundamental truths about human nature that his urban counterparts had forgotten while remaining genuinely naive about the complexities of modern metropolitan life. The script development process was unlike anything either man had experienced before. Unlike television work where ideas could be developed and refined over multiple episodes, they had one chance to get everything right. Every joke, every character moment, every plot development had to serve the larger purpose of introducing the world to Mick Dundee while telling a compelling story that would hold audience attention for nearly 2 hours. It was all about building the character, explained those involved in the writing process. Every scene, every throwaway line, every little comedic moment was designed to reveal something new about who Mick was and what he represented. The famous knife scene, which would become the film's most iconic moment, wasn't written as a showcase for special effects or dramatic tension. It was designed to demonstrate Mick's confidence, his practical wisdom, and his fundamental good nature all in a single unforgettable moment. But perhaps the most crucial element in the script was the relationship between Mick and Sue Charlton, the sophisticated New York journalist who would serve as both his guide to the modern world and his romantic interest. This relationship had to carry the emotional weight of the entire film while also serving as the vehicle for cultural commentary and fish-out-of-water humor. John Cornell understood that the success of this relationship would make or break the entire project. It couldn't be simply a matter of opposites attracting. There had to be genuine respect, admiration, and understanding between these two characters from completely different worlds. Sue had to see something in Mick that went beyond his exotic appeal, and Mick had to offer Sue something that her sophisticated urban life was missing. The challenge was enormous: create a character who was uniquely Australian but universally appealing, authentically rugged but not threatening, confident but not arrogant, wise but not pretentious. Mick Dundee had to embody the best aspects of Australian culture while avoiding the stereotypes and cliches that might make him seem like a caricature rather than a real person. As the script neared completion, Hall and Cornell knew they had something special, but they also understood that having a great script was only the first step in what would prove to be the most challenging project of their career. They would need to find financing, assemble a cast and crew, navigate the complexities of international production, and somehow maintain the authentic spirit of their vision while working within the commercial constraints of the film industry. The Mick Dundee that emerged from this development process was more than just a character. He was a statement about values, about the relationship between civilization and nature, about the importance of authenticity in a world increasingly dominated by artifice and pretension. He represented everything that Paul Hogan had been building toward throughout his career: the perfect fusion of entertainment and meaning, humor and wisdom, Australian identity and universal appeal. But as they would soon discover, creating the perfect character was only the beginning of their journey. Bringing Mick Dundee to life would require them to overcome obstacles they had never imagined, make sacrifices they weren't prepared for, and confront the harsh realities of an industry that often destroys the very authenticity it claims to value. Chapter 2: Against All Odds. Getting Crocodile Dundee made proved to be one of the most harrowing experiences of Paul Hogan and John Cornell's career. The Australian film industry in the mid-1980s was still in its infancy, lacking the infrastructure and financing mechanisms that would later support major production. Hollywood studios, meanwhile, couldn't understand the appeal of a character they perceived as essentially a joke, a crude stereotype that might work for television comedy but could never sustain audience interest through a feature-length. "We couldn't get Hoyts to back it," revealed those close to the financing struggle. They had somebody in the film industry, a director of note, who advised them that it was a second-rate script. Paul Hogan's a television star, he'd never make a movie, they shouldn't go near it with a barge pole. This dismissive attitude wasn't unique to one executive or one company, it was endemic throughout the industry. Paul and John found themselves caught between two entertainment worlds that seemed equally unwilling to take their vision serious. The situation became truly desperate when Kerry Packer, one of Australia's most powerful media moguls and a personal friend of John Cornell, initially invested over $1 million in the project only to withdraw his support at the last minute. He was advised by one of his employees that it wasn't going to work and he shouldn't invest, explained those familiar with the situation. Even though he was really great mates with John, he listened to this advisor and he pulled that money out. This withdrawal came at the worst possible time. Paul and John were already in pre-production, with cast and crew commitments made, locations scouted and equipment arranged. The sudden loss of such a significant portion of their budget threatened to destroy the entire project. Most filmmakers would have given up at this point, accepting that their dream was simply too ambitious for the realities of the marketplace. But Paul Hogan and John Cornell were not most filmmakers. They had come too far and invested too much, both financially and emotionally, to walk away from their vision. In a move that would define their partnership and demonstrate the depth of their commitment to the project, they decided to finance the film themselves, using every resource at their disposal. "We mortgaged our house and we went to moms and dads, family and friends, the cricketers," recalled those involved in the desperate fundraising effort. "We just put it out there as a prospectus. $5,000 was the minimum. My mom and dad put that much in. They hardly had that much, but they backed John and we raised the money that way." This grassroots financing approach was unprecedented for a major film production. Instead of relying on traditional industry sources, Paul and John essentially crowdfunded their movie decades before that term existed. They reached out to everyone they knew, friends from their cricket club, family members who could barely afford the investment, colleagues from their television work, anyone who believed in their vision enough to risk their own money on an unproven project. The pressure of this arrangement was enormous. These weren't faceless corporate investors who could absorb losses as part of their business model. These were people Paul and John knew personally, people who were trusting them with money they couldn't afford to lose. The weight of that responsibility added an extra layer of stress to an already challenging production. but it also provided something invaluable: complete creative control. Without studio interference or corporate oversight, Paul and John were free to make exactly the film they wanted to make. They could take risks, make unconventional choices, and stay true to their original vision without worrying about focus groups or market research or executive opinions about what would or wouldn't work. The production budget they assembled was modest even by Australian standards, approximately $8 million, which was a fraction of what a comparable Hollywood production would have cost. This financial constraint forced them to be creative and resourceful in ways that ultimately benefited the film. They couldn't rely on expensive special effects or elaborate set pieces. They had to trust in the strength of their story and the appeal of their character. "We shot the Outback sequences in Queensland, using local locations and non-professional actors to create an authentic sense of place," explained those involved in the production. The New York sequences were filmed guerrilla style, often without official permits or studio cooperation, giving the film a raw, documentary-like quality that enhanced its authenticity and emotional impact. This low-budget, independent approach meant that every dollar had to count. There was no room for waste, no opportunity for expensive reshoots, no cushion for mistakes or miscalculations. Paul and John had to get everything right the first time, relying on their experience, their instincts, and their deep understanding of what they were trying to achieve. As filming progressed, it became clear that something special was happening. The chemistry between Paul and Linda Kozlowski, who played Sue Charlton, was immediate and genuine. The Australian locations provided stunning backdrops that no studio soundstage could match. The supporting cast, many of them non-professional actors from the local community, brought an authenticity to their roles that perfectly complemented Paul's performance. But even as the production exceeded their hopes, Paul and John remained acutely aware of the enormous financial risk they had taken. If the film failed, they wouldn't just lose their own money, they would be responsible for the losses suffered by dozens of friends and family members who had trusted them with their savings. The pressure was suffocating at times, but it also provided motivation that no external financing could have matched. This wasn't just a business venture, it was a personal crusade, a statement of faith in their vision and their belief that audiences were hungry for something authentic in an increasingly artificial entertainment landscape. Chapter 3: Lightning in a Bottle. The production of Crocodile Dundee was a masterclass in making the most of limited resources while maintaining an uncompromising vision. Every aspect of the filmmaking process was designed to maximize authenticity while minimizing costs, creating an atmosphere of creative freedom that allowed the cast and crew to deliver performances that felt spontaneous and genuine. Paul Hogan threw himself into the role of Mick Dundee with the same total commitment that had characterized every phase of his career. But this wasn't just a matter of memorizing lines and hitting marks. Paul understood that he was creating a character who would represent Australia to the world, and he felt the weight of that responsibility in every scene. Paul threw himself into the role with total commitment, observed those on set. He learned survival skills, studied crocodile behavior, and spent time with actual bushmen to understand the worldview his character represented. But Paul also understood that Mick Dundee wasn't meant to be a completely realistic portrayal of an Australian outdoorsman. He was a mythical figure who embodied certain Australian values and perspectives while functioning as an entertaining character in a commercial film. This balance between authenticity and entertainment was perhaps the most delicate aspect of Paul's performance. Mick had to be believable enough that audiences would accept him as a real person, but charismatic enough to carry a feature film. He had to be distinctly Australian without being incomprehensible to international audiences. He had to be rugged and capable without being threatening, wise without being preachy, confident without being arrogant. The casting of Linda Kozlowski as Sue Charlton proved to be one of the most crucial decisions in the film's development. As the sophisticated New York journalist who becomes fascinated by Mick's authenticity and wisdom, she represented everything that Mick wasn't: urban, educated, wealthy, and worldly. But the chemistry between Paul and Linda was immediate and genuine, adding an unexpected romantic dimension to what could have been simply a fish-out-of-water comedy. Linda wanted to rehearse, Paul didn't, recalled those on the film's set. This fundamental difference in their approaches to acting created some initial tension, but it also contributed to the authentic feeling of their on-screen relationship. Linda brought the discipline and technical training of a Juilliard-educated actress, while Paul relied on his natural instincts and years of television experience. Linda found that weird because she came from a background of training with Juilliard, which was a highly regarded drama school in New York City. Paul hates to rehearse. He didn't even want to rehearse, explained those who witnessed their working relationship develop. So she's wondering, what the hell am I doing here? And she's in the Outback where there's everything to bite you and some things that might eat you. The Australian Outback locations presented challenges that went far beyond the usual difficulties of film production. Linda, coming from New York City, was genuinely intimidated by the harsh environment and exotic wildlife. She had this fear of bugs. She would sleep on the floor of Peter Feynman's cabin with Peter and his wife in the bed, her on the floor because she was too scared to stay in her own cabin. This real-world dynamic between the urban sophisticate and the rugged environment perfectly mirrored the relationship between their character. Linda's genuine fear and uncertainty in the Outback informed her performance, making Sue's reactions to Mick's world feel authentic and relatable to audiences who, like her, might be experiencing the Australian wilderness for the first time. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the production was the way real emotions began to mirror the fictional relationship between Mick and Sue. Paul and Linda's professional collaboration gradually developed into something deeper and more personal, creating a genuine chemistry that audiences could sense even if they couldn't articulate what they were responding to. Initially, Peter Feynman spent a lot of time talking her around, as did I when I was on set, recalled those involved in the production. About the times that I got to be in Kakadu with Linda, I was there to comfort and keep her company and reassure her that this will be all right. And then gradually they just found each other, and then they found love for each other. This real-life romance developing parallel to the fictional one created a level of authenticity in their scenes together that no amount of acting technique could have achieved. It was an actual love story, explained those who witnessed their relationship develop. It's a true love story, and they stayed together for 20 years. And that kind of thing, when you see that on a screen, it's intangible. You're not quite sure why you're relating to that so strongly, but it's almost subliminal. The famous kiss scene at the Billabong became legendary not just for its place in the film's narrative, but because it represented a genuine moment of connection between two people falling in love. The first time that they kiss at the Billabong in the film was their first kiss, and it was probably for real. It was absolutely for real, and you can see that in the way that Paul hesitates and looks at her a bit more, and then he kisses her. This blending of reality and fiction extended throughout the production, creating an atmosphere where the line between performance and authentic experience became increasingly blurred. The cast and crew weren't just making a movie, they were living the story they were telling, experiencing the cultural exchange and personal connections that formed the heart of the film's narrative. The most iconic scene in the film, the knife confrontation in New York, exemplified the careful balance between authenticity and entertainment that defined the entire production. The scene worked not because of elaborate special effects or dramatic music, but because of Paul's performance and the character moments that surrounded the famous line. When he's shaving with the razor and then he switches to the blade of the knife because he sees Sue coming. All through it there were just comedic throwaways that were written in the script that seemed really natural, but in totality made that film work so well. And always building the character, observed those involved in the production. The knife scene became memorable not just because of the famous line, "That's not a knife, this is a knife," but because of what it revealed about Mick's character. He wasn't trying to intimidate or threaten. He was teaching a lesson while protecting someone he cared about. The scene worked because audiences could see the twinkle in Paul's eye, the playful nature beneath the dramatic gesture. He had a glint in his eye because he was being playful, and John had seen that when they were filming, recalled those involved in post-production. The editing process revealed multiple takes of the scene, and Cornell's choice of which version to use demonstrated his deep understanding of both Paul's performance and the character they were creating together. In the editing room, John was looking for the feeling, the emotion that was inherent in that take. And that was, "I'm not going to hurt you, boy. I'm not going to blade your fate. I might cut up your jacket to teach you a lesson, but I'm not going to threaten you because I'm playing with you with my very big knife." As production wrapped, everyone involved knew they had captured something special. The combination of authentic locations, genuine chemistry between the leads, and Paul's fully realized performance had created a film that felt both distinctly Australian and universally appealing. But even the most optimistic projections couldn't have predicted the phenomenon that was about to be unleashed upon the world. Chapter 4: Conquering the World. When Crocodile Dundee premiered in Australia in April 1986, the reaction exceeded even Paul and John's most optimistic expectations. The film didn't just break box office records, it shattered them completely, becoming not just the highest-grossing Australian film of all time, but a cultural phenomenon that transcended simple entertainment. Mick Dundee became an instant icon, representing not just Australian values and humor but a way of being in the world that resonated with audiences across all demographic and cultural boundaries. Crocodile Dundee opened in Australia to rave reviews, huge crowds. Paul remembered about the initial reception. The film grossed over $47 million in Australia alone, an astronomical figure for the local market that proved Australian audiences were hungry for stories that reflected their own culture and values while entertaining them at the highest level. But the real test of their vision would come with international release. Would audiences outside Australia understand and embrace a character who was so specifically, authentically Australian? Would the humor translate across cultural boundaries? Would Mick Dundee be seen as a charming original or dismissed as a crude stereotype? The answer came swiftly and decisively when Crocodile Dundee opened in the United States in September. American audiences, who had been given no particular reason to expect anything special from an Australian comedy featuring an unknown lead actor, embraced Mick Dundee with an enthusiasm that surprised even the most optimistic industry projection. The film grossed over $74 million in the United States alone, making it not just one of the highest-grossing films of 1986, but one of the most successful comedies in cinema history. More importantly, the success wasn't just financial. It was cultural and social in ways that transcended the film industry and entered the realm of genuine phenomenon. "That's a knife" became a catchphrase that transcended the film itself, entering popular culture and everyday conversation in a way that very few movie quotes ever achieve. The line was quoted in other films, television shows, and even political speeches. It became shorthand for a particular kind of Australian confidence and practical wisdom that audiences found both amusing and admirable. But it wasn't just the memorable one-liners that made the film successful with international audiences. It was Paul's performance as Mick Dundee, which managed to be simultaneously larger than life and completely believable, exotic and familiar, heroic and humble. International audiences could see that while the situations in the film were often exaggerated for comedic effect, the characters' reactions and values were completely genuine. Mick Dundee represented qualities that people everywhere could admire and aspire to: authenticity in a world full of pretense, practical wisdom in a world obsessed with theoretical knowledge, natural confidence in a world dominated by artificial status markers, and genuine kindness in a world that often rewarded selfishness and aggression. The success transformed Paul Hogan from successful Australian television personality to global superstar practically overnight. Suddenly, he was fielding offers from major Hollywood studios, being invited to prestigious international events, and finding himself treated as an unofficial cultural ambassador for Australia itself. The transformation was dizzying, and for a man who had spent most of his life being underestimated and overlooked, more than a little surreal. "I've sat in a theater in London at a premiere with Prince Charles on one side of me and Princess Diana on the other, and how good does it?" Paul reflected years later on the incredible heights that his success had reached. "And they're both enjoying it, nudging me. What I don't know, I'm just a rigger." This quote captures something essential about Paul's character and the source of his enduring appeal. Even at the peak of his success, even when he was being treated as entertainment royalty by actual royalty, he never forgot who he was or where he came from. The humility and self-deprecating humor that had made him lovable as a bridge worker remained intact even when he was one of the most famous people on the planet. The cultural impact of Crocodile Dundee extended far beyond box office numbers or celebrity status. The film fundamentally changed how Australia was perceived by the rest of the world, replacing tired stereotypes and colonial-era assumptions with a modern, confident, and appealing vision of Australian identity and value. There are millions of people around the world who first learned about Australia through Crocodile Dundee and Paul Hogan. And I don't think that's a bad thing, reflected one cultural observer years later. The film served as an unofficial tourism advertisement, inspiring countless international visitors to experience Australia for themselves while also giving Australians a new sense of pride and confidence in their own cultural identity. The success also demonstrated something profound about the power of authentic storytelling in an increasingly artificial entertainment landscape. At a time when Hollywood was becoming ever more dependent on special effects, high-concept premises, and manufactured spectacle, Crocodile Dundee succeeded through the simplest and most old-fashioned of methods. Compelling characters, genuine emotion, and universal themes presented with humor and heart. Paul's influence on popular culture extended far beyond the immediate success of the film. He had proven that Australian stories could succeed on the global stage, that Australian accents and sensibilities could be understood and appreciated by international audiences, and that authenticity could be more powerful than artifice in connecting with viewers around the world. The film opened doors for generations of Australian performers who followed in Paul's footsteps, from major Hollywood stars like Russell Crowe and Nicole Kidman to comedians and television personalities who found international audiences for distinctly Australian content. Paul had created a template for how Australians could present themselves to the world with confidence and pride, setting a standard for authentic cultural representation that continues to influence Australian entertainment today. But perhaps most importantly, Crocodile Dundee proved that it was possible to create entertainment that was both mercilessly successful and culturally meaningful, that audiences were hungry for stories that celebrated positive values and genuine human connection, and that humor and heart could triumph over cynicism and sophistication. The success, however, would bring its own set of challenges and complications that Paul and John could never have anticipated. The very magnitude of their achievement would create expectations and pressures that would ultimately prove impossible to meet, setting in motion a series of events that would transform their greatest triumph into their most profound challenge. Chapter 5: The Weight of Success. The massive global success of Crocodile Dundee brought Paul Hogan and John Cornell everything they had dreamed of, and much they hadn't. Financial security, international recognition, creative opportunities, and cultural influence were theirs to enjoy. But success at this level also brought complications and pressures that would test their partnership, challenge their values, and ultimately threaten the very authenticity that had made their success possible in the first place. The immediate pressure came from the film industry itself, which was desperate to capitalize on the phenomenon they had created. Studios that had rejected the original film were now eager to finance sequels, spin-offs, and similar projects. Agents and managers who had ignored Paul's calls were suddenly competing for his attention. The same executives who had dismissed Mick Dundee as unmarketable were now demanding more of the same. When he went back to negotiate for Croc 2, they said, "You can take that straw out of your mouth now. We know what you're up to," recalled those involved in the sequel negotiations. "We'll fund it. The whole thing." And they did. The Hollywood machine had finally recognized Paul's value, but in doing so, they were already beginning to misunderstand what had made that value possible in the first place. The pressure to create a sequel was enormous, both financially and culturally. The first film had generated nearly $400 million worldwide, making it one of the most profitable independent productions in cinema history. The investors who had risked their savings on Paul and John's vision had received returns of 12 to 13 times their initial investment. Kerry Packer, who had withdrawn his support before production, was reportedly kicking himself over the fortune he had missed. But Paul and John understood that creating a sequel presented challenges that went far beyond simply repeating their previous success. The magic of the original film had come from its freshness, its authenticity, and the genuine surprise audiences felt at discovering this new character and world. How do you recapture lightning in a bottle? How do you surprise audiences who now know exactly what to expect? Crocodile Dundee II was greenlit with a much larger budget and significantly higher expectation. The intimate independent production that had created the original magic was replaced by a major studio operation, with all the oversight, interference, and creative compromises that such arrangements typically entail. The guerrilla filmmaking approach that had given the first film its authentic documentary-like feel was no longer possible or practical. The sequel was successful both critically and commercially, grossing a $240 million worldwide and satisfying most audiences and critics. But Paul and John both recognized that something ineffable had been lost in the transition from independent to studio production. The spontaneity, the creative freedom, and the personal investment that had made the original film special were difficult to maintain within the constraints of big-budget filmmaking. More troubling was the way success began to change Paul's relationship with the character that had made him famous. Mick Dundee had emerged organically from Paul's own personality and experiences, representing an authentic expression of his values and worldview. But as the character became increasingly valuable as intellectual property, Paul found himself under pressure to perform Mick Dundee in contexts that had nothing to do with filmmaking or storytelling. Every public appearance, every interview, every promotional opportunity became a performance where Paul was expected to embody the charm, humor, and folksy wisdom that audiences associated with Mick Dundee. The line between Paul Hogan the person and Mick Dundee the character began to blur in ways that were both professionally beneficial and personally troubling. The success also created unrealistic expectations for everything Paul did afterward. Every project would be measured against Crocodile Dundee, every performance compared to Mick Dundee, every career decision evaluated in terms of whether it lived up to the phenomenon he had created. The character that had liberated Paul from the constraints of Australian television had, in its success, created new constraints that were in many ways more limiting than anything he had experienced before. International fame brought additional complications that Paul had never anticipated. The man who had charmed audiences with his unpretentious authenticity found himself operating in a world where image management, public relations, and carefully controlled media access were considered essential tools of career survival. The simplicity and directness that had made Mick Dundee appealing were increasingly at odds with the sophisticated machinery of modern celebrity. Personal relationships became more complex as Paul's fame made it difficult to distinguish between genuine friendship and opportunistic networking. The unpretentious egalitarianism that had characterized his relationships in Australia was harder to maintain in an international entertainment industry where status, wealth, and access were the primary currencies of social interaction. Perhaps most challenging was the way success began to affect Paul's relationship with Australia itself. The man who had represented authentic Australian values to the world found himself spending increasing amounts of time in Los Angeles and New York, working on international projects and navigating the complex demands of global startup. Critics began questioning whether Paul was losing touch with the roots that had made him successful in the first place. The pressure to maintain the Mick Dundee persona while also growing as an actor and artist created internal conflicts that Paul struggled to resolve. He wanted to challenge himself with different kinds of roles and projects, but audiences and industry executives were reluctant to accept him as anything other than the character who had made him famous. Every attempt to expand his range was seen as a betrayal of the authentic Australian identity that was his most valuable asset. John Cornell, meanwhile, was dealing with his own set of challenges as he tried to manage Paul's career while also pursuing his own creative and business interests. The partnership that had been built on friendship, shared values, and mutual respect was now operating within an industry context where enormous sums of money and competing interests could strain even the strongest relationship. The weight of their success was becoming more apparent with each passing year. What had begun as a simple desire to tell an entertaining story about Australian values and humor had become a global phenomenon that carried expectations, responsibilities, and pressures neither man had anticipated when they first conceived of Mick Dundee. The character who had set them free had, in his very success, created new forms of creative and personal imprisonment. Chapter 6: The Impossible Dream of Recapture. By the late 1990s, the entertainment landscape had changed dramatically since Mick Dundee first charmed international audiences. The success of Crocodile Dundee and its sequel had established Paul Hogan as a global brand, but it had also created an almost impossible standard for any future project to meet. The question that haunted Paul, John Cornell, and everyone involved in the franchise was whether it would be possible to recapture the magic that had made the original film such a phenomenon. The development of Crocodile Dundee in Los Angeles began with the best of intentions and the highest of hopes. Paul and John believed they could return to the character that had made them famous while updating the concept for a new generation of audience. The idea seemed sound: take Mick Dundee to Hollywood, the heart of the entertainment industry and explore how this authentic Australian character would react to the ultimate artificial environment. My favorite all-time movies, probably Rocky, but by the time you got to 3 or 4, it's like, enough. Paul later reflected on the decision to make a third film. No one even knows I did a third one. This rueful observation captures the fundamental challenge facing any attempt to extend a successful franchise, the law of diminishing returns that makes each successive installment feel more forced and less essential than the one before. The production of the third film was haunted by the absence of the elements that had made the original so special. John Cornell was dealing with health issues that limited his involvement in the project. The intimate, independent production approach that had characterized the first film was no longer feasible given the expectations and budgets associated with a major studio release. Most importantly, the element of surprise that had made Mick Dundee such a revelation to international audiences was impossible to recreate. Audiences knew what to expect from a Crocodile Dundee film, and this knowledge transformed what had once been delightful surprises into predictable formula. The fish-out-of-water scenarios that had seemed fresh and original in 1986 felt tired and derivative into the culture clash humor that had once provided genuine insight into the differences between Australian and American values now seemed forced and artificial. Paul himself was 17 years older than he had been when he first played Mick Dundee, and while he maintained the physical presence and charismatic screen personality that had made the character famous, something ineffable had been lost. The youthful confidence and natural charm that had made Mick so appealing were harder to maintain as Paul entered his 60s, carrying the weight of years of fame, public scrutiny, and personal challenges. The critics were brutal in their assessment of Crocodile Dundee in Los Angeles. Reviews characterized the film as unnecessary, tired, and creatively bankrupt. Box office performance was disappointing, particularly in international markets where the first 2 films had been most successful. The film grossed only $57 million worldwide, a fraction of what its predecessors had earned and barely enough to cover production and marketing costs. More damaging than the financial disappointment was the way the third film's failure seemed to retroactively diminish the reputation of the entire franchise. Critics and audiences began to question whether the original films had been as good as they remembered, or whether nostalgia had inflated their importance in popular culture. The character that had once seemed timeless and universal suddenly appeared dated and culturally specific. Paul found himself in the impossible position of defending a film he knew wasn't successful while also trying to protect the legacy of the character that had defined his career. The interviews and promotional appearances that had once been joyful celebrations of his success became exercises in damage control and public relations management. The failure of the third film also highlighted the extent to which Paul had become identified with a single character and a specific moment in entertainment history. While other actors his age were able to reinvent themselves or transition into different kinds of roles, Paul found that audiences and industry executives could only see him as Mick Dundee. Every project proposal was evaluated in terms of how it related to or departed from the character that had made him famous. This creative imprisonment was made more painful by the knowledge that Paul possessed genuine acting talent and range that had never been fully explored. His television work had demonstrated his ability to create multiple characters and adapt to different comedic styles. His natural intelligence and life experience gave him the tools to tackle more sophisticated dramatic material. But the very success of Mick Dundee had made it financially and professionally dangerous to take the kinds of creative risks that might have led to artistic growth and personal fulfillment. The aftermath of Crocodile Dundee in Los Angeles marked the end of an era for Paul Hogan. The character that had transformed his life and career was no longer a source of creative inspiration or commercial opportunity. Instead, Mick Dundee had become a reminder of past glories that could not be recaptured and a burden of expectations that could not be fulfilled. The dream of creating a successful third film had revealed the cruel truth about entertainment franchises, that success creates its own form of failure, that popularity can become a prison, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a beloved character is to allow their story to end while the audience still wants more. For Paul, this realization was both liberating and devastating. He was free from the pressure to continually reproduce his greatest success, but he was also forced to confront the possibility that his most significant creative achievement was behind him. The man who had once conquered the world with a simple story about an Australian crocodile hunter was now faced with the challenge of defining himself beyond the character that had made him famous. Chapter 7: The Price of Immortality. The failure of Crocodile Dundee in Los Angeles marked more than just the end of a franchise. It represented the beginning of a painful reckoning with the long-term consequences of creating a character too successful for its own good. Paul Hogan found himself trapped in a paradox that few entertainers ever experience. His greatest professional triumph had become his most significant creative limitation. In the years following the third film's disappointing reception, Paul struggled to find projects that would allow him to grow as an actor while still maintaining his commercial viability. The entertainment industry, which had once courted him desperately, now seemed uncertain about what to do with a performer so closely identified with a single character. Every script, every role offer, every creative opportunity was evaluated through the lens of how it related to Mick Dundee. The few projects that Paul did pursue during this period demonstrated both his desire to expand his range and the challenges he faced in doing so. Films like Strange Bedfellows and Charlie and Boots showed flashes of the intelligence and emotional depth that had always been present in Paul's work, but they struggled to find audiences who were willing to accept him in roles that departed significantly from the Mick Dundee template. The struggle was made more difficult by the way popular culture had begun to treat the Crocodile Dundee films themselves. What had once been celebrated as groundbreaking entertainment was now often dismissed as a quaint relic of the values that Mick Dundee had represented: authenticity, simplicity, masculine confidence, cultural pride, were increasingly seen as outdated or problematic by critics who viewed them through the lens of contemporary social and political concern. Paul found himself in the position of defending not just his own career choices, but an entire worldview that had once seemed uncontroversial but now appeared to some as politically incorrect or culturally insensitive. The character who had been created to celebrate the best aspects of Australian culture was now sometimes criticized as reinforcing stereotypes or promoting outdated gender role. This cultural shift was particularly painful because it seemed to miss the essential humanity and good-heartedness that had made Mick Dundee appealing in the first place. The character had never been meant as a realistic portrayal of all Australian men, but rather as an idealized representation of certain positive qualities: honesty, loyalty, practical wisdom, and genuine kindness that transcended cultural boundaries. The personal cost of this professional struggle was significant. Paul had spent decades of his life embodying and promoting values that he genuinely believed in, only to find those same values increasingly questioned or dismissed by the very industry that had once celebrated them. The disconnect between his personal beliefs and the changing entertainment landscape created a sense of alienation that affected both his professional choices and his personal well-being. Perhaps most frustrating was the way the entertainment industry seemed to have learned all the wrong lessons from the success of Crocodile Dundee. Instead of recognizing the importance of authenticity, genuine emotion, and universal themes, Hollywood seemed to focus on the superficial elements that could be easily replicated: the accent, the costume, the catchphrases, and the fish-out-of-water scenario. Numerous attempts were made to create similar characters and stories, but these imitations inevitably failed because they lacked the genuine foundation of experience, values, and cultural understanding that had made Mick Dundee authentic. The entertainment industry's tendency to reduce successful concepts to their most commercially exploitable elements meant that the deeper meanings and genuine emotions that had made the original films special were lost in translation. Paul watched as his creation was simultaneously celebrated and misunderstood, honored and exploited, remembered and forgotten. The character that had once represented everything he believed about storytelling, entertainment, and human connection had become a commodity to be analyzed, imitated, and ultimately discarded when it no longer seemed commercially relevant. The realization that Mick Dundee's cultural moment had passed was both liberating and devastating for Paul. On one hand, it freed him from the pressure to continually reproduce his greatest success and allowed him to explore other aspects of his creativity and personality. On the other hand, it forced him to confront the possibility that his most significant contribution to popular culture was behind him, that the character who had defined his career would ultimately be remembered as a product of its time rather than a timeless creation. The weight of this knowledge influenced every aspect of Paul's later career. He became more selective about projects, more protective of his reputation, and more conscious of how his choices might affect the legacy of the character that had made him famous. The spontaneity and risk-taking that had characterized his early career were replaced by a more cautious approach designed to preserve rather than expand his cultural footprint. But perhaps the most profound impact was on Paul's relationship with his own creativity. The man who had once been willing to bet everything on an untested idea now found it difficult to trust his instincts or take the kinds of risks that had made his success possible in the first place. The fear of failure, which had never paralyzed him before, became a significant factor in his decision-making process. The immortality that Mick Dundee had achieved in popular culture came at a cost that Paul was still paying years later. The character lived on in reruns, cable television broadcasts, streaming services, and cultural references, ensuring that Mick Dundee would outlive his creator and continue to entertain audiences for generations to come. But for Paul, this immortality felt more like a gilded cage than a lasting achievement, a reminder of what he had accomplished but also of what he could never accomplish again. Epilogue: the legend lives on. Today, more than 3 decades after Mick Dundee first charmed international audiences, the character's place in popular culture remains secure even as the entertainment landscape has changed beyond recognition. Crocodile Dundee continues to be discovered by new generations of viewers through streaming services, cable television, and cultural references that keep the film and its themes alive in the collective consciousness. The enduring appeal of Mick Dundee speaks to something deeper than nostalgia or simple entertainment value. In an age of increasing cynicism, artificial intelligence, and digital mediation, the character represents a form of authentic humanity that many people find increasingly rare. Mick's directness, his practical wisdom, his genuine kindness, and his unpretentious confidence offer a refreshing alternative to the complexity and sophistication that dominate contemporary culture. Paul Hogan, now in his 80s, has achieved a form of peace with the character that defined his career. The resentment and frustration that once characterized his relationship with Mick Dundee has evolved into something approaching gratitude and acceptance. He understands that creating a character who achieved genuine immortality in popular culture is an achievement that few entertainers ever experience, regardless of the personal costs involved. "I created something that made people happy," Paul has said in recent interviews, a simple statement that captures both the modesty and the profound significance of his achievement. In a world where entertainment is increasingly designed to provoke, challenge, or disturb audiences, there is something almost revolutionary about work that simply aims to bring joy and laughter to people's lives. The influence of Crocodile Dundee can still be seen in contemporary entertainment, from action comedies that blend humor with adventure to romantic comedies that explore cultural differences. The template that Paul and John Cornell created, authentic characters in extraordinary situations, universal themes expressed through specific cultural perspectives, humor that comes from character rather than situation, continues to influence filmmakers around the world. More importantly, the film's impact on Australia's cultural identity and international reputation remains significant. The confidence and pride that Australians felt as their culture was celebrated on the global stage helped inspire generations of artists, entertainers, and cultural ambassadors who have continued to share Australian stories with the world. For Paul personally, the legacy of Mick Dundee has become a source of both pride and philosophical reflection. The character taught him about the power of storytelling, the importance of authenticity, and the way popular culture can shape how people see themselves and their place in the world. These lessons have influenced not just his professional choices, but his understanding of what it means to create something that outlasts its creator. The rise and fall of Crocodile Dundee is ultimately a story about the double-edged nature of extraordinary success in the entertainment industry. The same forces that can elevate a simple idea into a global phenomenon can also trap its creator in patterns that prevent further growth and exploration. The immortality that beloved characters achieve in popular culture comes at the cost of creative freedom for the performers who bring them to life. But it is also a story about the enduring power of genuine human connection, authentic emotion, and universal themes expressed through specific cultural perspective. Mick Dundee succeeded because he represented qualities that people everywhere could recognize and admire, regardless of their cultural background or personal experiences. As Paul Hogan enters the final chapter of his life and career, he can take satisfaction in knowing that he created something that brought joy to millions of people around the world, that represented the best aspects of his culture and values, and that will continue to entertain and inspire audiences long after its creator is gone. The man who started as a bridge worker and became a global icon has achieved a form of immortality that few artists ever experience. The legend of Crocodile Dundee lives on, not just as entertainment, but as a reminder of what is possible when authentic creativity meets genuine human emotion, when cultural pride meets universal appeal, and when the simple desire to make people happy transcends the complex machinery of modern entertainment. In the end, that may be Paul Hogan's greatest achievement, proving that sometimes the most profound impact comes from the simplest intentions, and that true success is measured not in dollars earned or records broken, but in the lasting joy brought to human hearts around the world.